So essentially I structured this as almost like 3 mini presentations within one. So giving you background on how we want to approach a training paradigm as a whole, and then looking at regressions, progressions, and exercise variability, and how we can build that into a plan with this underlying framework of training. The biggest thing that I want to hit home is that training is an art and a science. There's no right or wrong, there's only trade-offs. So what we need to do as clinicians, strength coaches, practitioners of any kind, is have a robust knowledge of the system within which we're working, and then being able to manipulate the variables, understand the trade-offs one way or the other, and make the most educated decision we can for our clients. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Oneid. I pride myself on being a walking contradiction, so I have multiple master's degrees. I also have neck tattoos and hand tattoos. I'm a husband, a coach, a mentor, an educator, and an athlete. I'm the co-owner of Master Athletic Performance. I'm also the co-owner of Coaches Corner University, which is an educational platform for coaches to do continuing education. And we bridge the gap between evidence-based practice and in the trenches information. I have a Master of Science in Sports Management from Robert Morris University. I also have a Master's of Exercise Science from South Florida. I've been coaching for 16 years, worked with over 5,000 athletes, all the way from NCAA, CIS, professional sports, all the way to soccer moms and kids. So very wide array of experience. I also do have some comparable experience with your populations. I did work for 6 years for Manulife as a rehabilitation specialist. So I actually built Master Athletic Performance when I was working for Manulife, and then kind of transitioned into that, doing that full time. So today we're going to talk about the training paradigm as a whole, going over the variables, progressive overload, stimulus response adaptation. We'll look at SRA, or stimulus response adaptation, and progressive overload. We'll also look at stimulus to fatigue ratio, understanding the impacts of certain exercises on our ability to recover, and then maximizing stimulus to fatigue with adaptation, and then how we manipulate the system to maximize both of those things. We'll look at exercise variation, how that influences intensity. We'll also discuss what intensity is, different variation strategies, methods of progression, creating a runway to build up our athletes, and then putting that all together again in the system. And lastly, looking at the different progressions, regressions, and trade-offs inherent within the training paradigm, understanding those, what can we progress and regress, what trade-offs are occurring, why we would make those decisions, and then again, how to practically apply that within our system. So, the training paradigm as a whole, it's the construct with which we conceptualize our training. That's all it is. I like to look at it as the matrix. So in the matrix, when Neo finally sees that everything is just numbers on the screen. That's what I look at. It's all variables, it's all math. So when we're looking at it, it's like, are rules really rules? No, we all know that, right? They're just constraints. So we work within our constraints and manipulate the system. The SAID principle. So we're looking at specific adaptation to impose demands. We're gonna get better at what we do. So we need to understand that every exercise is going to have a specific application to get better at that exercise, but that exercise will have a dynamic correspondence somewhere else. So what are we using that exercise for within the grand scheme of our training? We'll always need to implement progressive overload, which is essentially the stimulus must exceed the previously established capacity. So we always need to be pushing forward with our capacity, improving our ability to grade that exposure over time. And then we have to understand we're dealing with people, right? So there's a law of individual difference. Different person, different time, the different context, the different situation around which they're living is all going to affect the benefits of that intervention. And then all of this influences the recovery of that person, how they decay fatigue, how they maintain fitness, and obviously how they progress their fitness over time. These are the constraints with which we're able to manipulate. As long as we work within that system, we're good to go. So, the variables of training, you're looking at volume, intensity, frequency, and exercise selection. Within that, the volume is essentially like the volume of a specific movement, the volume of that one training day, the volume of the training week, and then the volume of the training block. The intensity, we have either relative or absolute. So how subjectively difficult an exercise is, or a set is, versus how absolutely loaded that is. So a set for me at 500 may be just the same difficulty as a set for you at 300. Same relative intensity, different absolute intensities. They both matter. Then we're going to look at frequency, so how that relates to intensity and volume. I can't do very, very heavy things very often. So as my intensity comes up, volume has to come down. Then we're looking at exercise selection, so the specificity of the exercise, the variability of the exercise, and then how many total exercises are we doing, right? And why do we manipulate these variables? We're trying to achieve progressive overload. And the progressive overload inherent within that variation is going to be dependent on what specific adaptation we're trying to look for, and this is what I told you I would look like Rain Man within a presentation. And how do we determine the manner with which we manipulate these variables? Number one, the goal, right? We want to keep the goal, and we also need to make sure that we can recover. I can write a training program on a piece of paper, and it could look like the most well thought out thing that has ever been done, but the reality is, if that person can't recover from what I'm asking them to do, they will not adapt or cannot improve. So progressive overload. In order for an individual to achieve a certain training adaptation, the body must be stressed by working against a stimulus or a load that is greater than that with which it has been accustomed. Overload ensures improvement by challenging changes in resistance, terrain, movement complexity, and many others. The principle of progression is in order to achieve the desired training adaptation. I'm not going to repeat that. Anyway, we have to progress the overload, but we can only progress the overload as much as we can recover from it. Okay? And I gave a citation if you'd like to check that out. Okay. So stimulus response adaptation, or SRA, essentially refers to, we have a stimulus, it's going to provide a specific stress, that's going to accumulate some form of fatigue, okay? That will detrain the person. So if I go in and hit a max squat, the next day I will not be as strong as I was that day, okay? So I have a detraining adaptation. Then there's a compensation to that by the body, right? Compensation to the stress. There's a neurological response, so we improve our ability to perform that skill. There's also a biochemical response, either hypertrophy, hyperplasia, which will allow us to build up more tissue to support whatever activity that we're doing. And through that, we have a supercompensation, which will actually increase the level of fitness over time. So essentially what we're trying to do is we're going through this staircase of SRA over time. Now, SRA principle kind of been vilified recently in the research, going towards more of a fatigue fitness model where we accumulate fatigue to accumulate fitness. I find the SRA curve is just a really easy way to conceptualize what we're trying to do. Right? We're trying to impose a stress on the body, make sure that stress is responded to in the appropriate manner, and we're capitalizing on the adaptation that we're going after, which can be specific to the task. So the magnitude and type of the stimulus is going to be what drives adaptation, and the rate of response typically is going to be comparable to that. So the larger the impulse of stress, the longer it's going to take to recover from. We can look at, the intensity of that stimulus, the volume of the stimulus, and then the frequency of the stimulus. So in terms of intensity, again, percentage of 1 rep max or level of difficulty. The level of difficulty also relates to, how much of that stress. So the volume, weight, reps, sets, tonnage of the movement, of the session, of the mesocycle, and then how many sessions are we doing per mesocycle, per macrocycle, or per microcycle, per mesocycle, or per macrocycle. And the question I want to ask of you, and without having it on the board is tough, but are any of the things that I've spoken about mutually exclusive? Right? So when we talk about volume, when we talk about intensity, when we talk about frequency, when we talk about, adaptation, none of these are mutually exclusive. They all interact with one another. So by manipulating a single variable, there must be a trade-off in another area. So that's what we're looking at manipulating. So there's a few different ways that we can manipulate stimulus response adaptation and progressive overload. So we look at manipulating time under tension. So intra-set, so how many reps, the tempo, whether we're using intensifiers, so something like a rest pause, a cluster set, forced reps, so for reps beyond failure, or drop sets, those will all increase the time with which we are under tension. We look at interset duration, so modifying rest periods here. Some of us will do, EMOM sets that you've probably seen, or just manipulating how many reps you perform per minute or per seconds, stuff like that. We can also manipulate the locus of stability, so where the center of mass of your body is in relation to the load. Think a front squat versus a back squat, or even a Zercher squat, or a counterbalance squat where something's in front of you. Even manipulating the foot position, elevating the heel, elevating the toe. This will all change your center of mass and provide a different stimulus. Also looking at unilateral loading or offset loading. And then the parameters with which we load. What type of barbell are we using? What type of implement are we using? Whether the stability of that movement is internal, so if I am supporting the load with my spine, or if my stability is externalized to a machine. That will also impact the stability of the movement. And then we can look at manipulating ranges of motion. Think a deadlift versus a deficit deadlift. The range of motion of the movement will also impact the level of stimulus you're going to provide. That can also increase or decrease the relative intensity of that movement at a given absolute load. This is where things kind of get fun. We look at stimulus to fatigue ratio. So the magnitude of the stimulus dictates the rate of response, as I said before. The deeper you dig a hole, the longer it's going to take to come out. But certain things dig that hole deeper than others. It's important to understand what things those are. So it's somewhat difficult to describe fatigue, especially in the research. It's just a very under-researched realm. My business partner with Coach's Corner is actually doing his PhD in fatigue management at Oklahoma State. So looking at like interpersonal differences. There are population differences in response to fatigue, morphology, competency, like a bigger person, like myself, versus like a bigger man versus a smaller female are gonna have different responses to fatigue accumulation, okay? And then, the literature will say, what drives more fatigue, reps or load? It depends, okay, right? So you could take, assuming that both sets are taken to failure, a set of 20 is going to be more centrally fatiguing, so more CNS fatiguing, than a set of 1 to 3. But that set of 1 to 3 will be more muscularly fatiguing than that set of 20. Which to me is counterintuitive, right? I would think that my muscles would get more messed up. We'll get more messed up doing a set of 20 than a set of 1, but it's actually the opposite. Your CNS gets more messed up doing a set of 20 than it does doing a set of 1. That's what the research says. But anecdotally, we don't really know, because quantifying central fatigue versus peripheral fatigue is challenging. Then the cost of doing business is recovery. So we need to choose our weapon carefully. We need to understand the circumstance, we need to understand the population, we need to understand the implementation. Again, keep the goal. So whatever goal it is, you're going to choose the best tool in your toolbox to accomplish that goal. And essentially, the duration of that stimulus adaptation response, as I said before, is going to be based on the accumulation of fatigue. And the accumulation of fatigue is the magnitude of the stimulus. Okay, so this next slide, SFR and adaptation. Just kind of peruse that. I'm not going to go through it. But that question at the bottom is important. So can you think of movements that might be better for one intent than another? And that looks at we have strength, we have hypertrophy, and I like to qualify that as neuromuscular motor learning, right? So an activity like a single leg RDL is probably not going to be a movement you would choose to build strength. Probably not a movement you're going to choose to put a lot of tissue on the skeleton. But in terms of neuromuscular coordination of hip, that would be a movement you would choose there. But hypertrophy, well, I want a very high relative intensity, probably not going to be as heavily loaded as a barbell movement, but because I'm externally stabilized to a machine, there's less axial load, I'm not digging my hole as deep, et cetera, et cetera. So we essentially have a spectrum of exercises in terms of what we would choose for one intent versus another. When looking at this, you can simplify it and say machines are probably better for hypertrophy, barbells are probably better for building strength, but that's all relative to the goal that we're trying to achieve. In an ideal scenario, we're using both, and we're trying to get the best of both worlds. When we're looking at manipulating the system, we have to address lifestyle, and we have to address recoverability first. So I like to call this inside-out auto-regulation. People also often talk about auto-regulation as, I don't feel so great, I'm gonna do a few less sets today. Well, what if instead of manipulating the training to accommodate the lifestyle, we started improving people's lifestyle to accommodate more training, better adaptations? That's inside out. So it starts with me. Before I manipulate variables outside of myself, I'm gonna take care of me. So sleeping the appropriate amount, achieving a caloric surplus to facilitate recovery, managing stressors, both external and internal, moving as much as we can throughout the day, and addressing our systemic health, right? An unhealthy person, in terms of someone with poor lipid profile, type 2 diabetes, this person is just not gonna recover the same as someone who is in a better health situation. Then once recoverability is maximized, now we can talk about training. So we address the low-hanging fruit first. I like to conceptualize this as a budget. So like we just bought a house. You're gonna have to pay your income is gonna be fixed or flexible. So if I own my own business, I have a flexible income. I'm also gonna have fixed expenses. So my mortgage, my car, these are all the things that are the same every month. Then I have my variable expenses like groceries, new shoes that I like to buy, savings, and then am I being overdrawn, right? So do I have bad credit? And I used to have in here that you're not gonna get any dates if you have bad credit, but probably not true at this point. Then you have your recoverability budget. So your income, that's your sleep, that's your nutrition, that's your lifestyle. Your fixed expenses, that's gonna be depending on the goal or the training intent. But then your variable expenses, the things that we can play with, volume, intensity, frequency, exercise selection. Your savings is how much recoverability you have access to simply by addressing your income. And then being overdrawn in this instance, overreaching, overtraining, and then obviously that's going to lead to a decrease in performance. And understanding how each strategy influences the next. So manipulating intensity is going to influence how much volume you can tolerate, but then by changing up the exercises that we use and how they're range of motion, locus of stability, time under tension, center of mass, all those things can change how much intensity you can tolerate and how much volume you can tolerate. There's a predictable framework with which we can extrapolate out and make more educated decisions, right? So we're expanding our toolbox. We're looking at the magnitude and type of stimulus, the volume and frequency of our exposures to that stimulus, and then the recoverability of the person. So in this slide, with all the stuff on the outside, we essentially looked at which variable you would manipulate to get what intent. So if I'm looking at developing strength, I'll be primarily looking at modifying intensity, volume, and frequency. If I'm primarily trying to look at neuromuscular adaptations, I probably won't care much about intensity, but I'll play more with frequency because I'm after more motor learning. I'll play more with time under tension because I'll spend time in those positions. I will manipulate the locus of stability, right? I'll manipulate the range of motion. So essentially, the manipulation that you're making is specific to the goal that you're trying to achieve. And the intent is going to be determined by the needs assessment and the time of year. So say I have an athlete, if we're specifically talking about a barbell athlete or even a sport performance athlete, probably not going to be worried much about locus of stability right before they compete, right? Because I'm going to be pulling back all unnecessary volume. The training is going to be specific to the task. When they're in the off season, far away, now we're addressing deficits. So the intent is gonna vary based on time of the year. Again, looking at recoverability. In a perfect scenario, how many of you are familiar with the concurrent training model? You ever heard that term? So a concurrent periodization model or concurrent training model essentially means addressing multiple training adaptations concurrently. So looking at building strength, hypertrophy, power, stability, speed strength, all these things at the same time. But all you're doing is if you're looking at a pie, and that pie is the entire training, different times of the year will allocate different portions of that pie to different adaptations. So when I'm peaking for a powerlifting meet, most of that pie is gonna be strength. Right after that meet, most of that pie is gonna be devoted to general fitness, rehab, neuromuscular adaptations to compensate for that period when those were neglected, okay? And what we're trying to do is bring up multiple qualities at the same time, using all the tools at our disposal and making sure that the goal stays the goal based on what time of year we're after. I don't know why that's blank. Weird. Should have been another slide there. But any questions on that first part? So we essentially understand the training paradigm as a whole. Okay? Now we're looking at exercise variation and how that influences intensity. So what is intensity? We spoke about relative intensity and absolute intensity. Relative intensity essentially refers to effort. You can measure this a few different ways. So we have rate of perceived exertion. We're looking at like a Borg scale up to 21. Usually in training we use 1 to 10. It's the easiest way to conceptualize it. It's challenging when you're dealing with lifters because they always want to push hard. They don't necessarily know, like also measuring like RPE 6. It's hard to know when you have 4 reps in the tank. It's just a challenging thing to measure. But RPE is one tool that we use. We also use reps in reserve. So if you did a set of 10 and a reps in reserve 2, that means you probably had 2 more reps left. So you did 10 reps with your 12 rep max. We can also use a percentage of 1 rep max within there as well, which would be more so in absolute intensity, right? So the percentage of that single rep that you could use. Ideally, I like to use both. So I'll give a range of percentage of 1 rep max. I'll say you need to do a set of 8 between 75 and 80% of your 1 rep max, keeping it at an RPE of 8 or 9. Okay? But there's trade-offs that exist everywhere, and there's a relationship between relative intensity and absolute intensity when you standardize for the rep range. And then in terms of exercise selection, you might be able to lift more on one exercise than the other within the same percentage range of absolute intensity. And it's important to distinguish between the two because we want to make sure that the desired adaptation stays what it is, the goal stays the goal. We want to make sure we monitor our recovery, we accommodate for volume, and then we look at what training period we're in and how that influences everything. And so we can look at variation a few different ways, and I talked about a couple of them before. Load, the medium with which that load is applied to the body, whether it be a bar, dumbbell, kettlebell, whether we use accommodating resistance like bands or change, whether we're using machines, manipulating the center of mass, whether that be anterior, posterior, close to the center of mass, offset, lateral to the body. We can look at range of motion, globally of the entire movement, or isolated to a specific joint. So an example here would be a split squat, so rear foot elevated split squat. I can perform that movement with a very vertical torso angle, maximize movement above the hip. I can also do it with a forward torso angle, maximize movement above the knee and the ankle. Right? There's a lot of different ways I can manipulate the global range of motion by adding maybe a deficit to the front foot, but then also manipulating torso angle to address different joints. This will all play into what variation we're trying to achieve, what adaptation we're trying to target. We can also alter the tempo, the eccentric or the concentric. We can add in isometrics or pauses. We can change the rep range. And then lastly, we can change the rep velocity, right? We can have the person move faster or slower. And so with each one, for progressing absolute intensity, weight's going up. We're progressing relative intensity, that's everything else. Because if I keep that absolute intensity the same, but then I make the range of motion of the exercise larger, relative intensity is going to come up. It's going to be more challenging. And then progression is relative to the goal. Here's a question for you. Could a progression be in fact a regression?
If you train it at a higher load, I guess.
There you go. Every progression comes with a regression somewhere else. There's a trade-off. So you need to know that if you're making that decision to progress one aspect of the training, you're accepting the trade-off that something else will come down. Finding a healthy balance is key, but we're also trying to maximize output. Right? I don't really care if, like, this is something where I think in the rehab space, not necessarily got it wrong, because there is no right or wrong, but some people take it to the far end of the spectrum where they make an exercise so challenging that the ability to apply load within that movement is completely reduced. And that's where the transferability of training comes in, right? So if I'm doing a single leg squat with a Bosu ball, if I can't put any load on my body, and the goal of my training is to be able to return to a weight room and load my spine, the movement is so divorced from the training process that that dynamic correspondence is almost lost. So as practitioners, as clinicians, as strength coaches, our goal is to find that smallest amount of variability that allows us to overcome the deficit while keeping as much specificity as possible. And essentially we want to establish a starting point, so we're meeting the person where they are with the goal of progressing them. So this is called, I call this the runway of progression. So we determine an end goal and work backwards, and that start point from that end goal is wherever that person needs to start. So look at a low back pain patient. Patient comes in, they can't hinge at the hip. They might need to start with a McGill Big 3. But as soon as we can move without pain, we have to load that position because the goal is loading at the end of it. Right? So that bird dog might turn into a single leg RDL. Right? Same loading strategy, right? But now we're under load. Okay? Here's a good question. How long do you need before you move to the next level of progression? Who knows? Right? We need to have some sort of KPIs or some sort of benchmarks. KPI is a key performance indicator. So are we looking at the quality of the movement? Are we looking at perception of pain? Are we looking at relative load? Are we looking at an arbitrary unit of time? Which sometimes that could be it. Hey, we're gonna do this for 6 weeks regardless of how you feel. Some people do it that way. But again, returning back to the SAID principle, we're not trying to stray too far. We're trying to keep the goal, and we're trying to keep that specificity of adaptation in mind. So again, returning to that bird dog example, as soon as I've gotten as much as I can into that bird dog, I have to change it. Right? If take it more specific, say I'm using a front squat. As soon as I maximize that front squat to the point where the person can't hold the rack position anymore, and the goal is to return to back squatting, well, let's put her on the rack. Let's put a high bar position. Then when their high bar is maximized, go to a low bar. We'll kind of go through some progressions like that as we go. So when we think in terms of our training paradigm, everything's going to be goal driven, but it's also time limited because people have timelines that they want to meet, whether it be an arbitrary, like, I want to compete on this date. I'm the first person to say, hey, you might want to compete on this date, but based on how your body responds to what we're trying to do, that might need to change. But the goal needs to stay the goal. Where in our training plan are we? Are we off season, right? Are we focusing on general physical preparedness, where our specificity would be low, absolute intensity would be low to moderate, but relative intensity would be skewed towards more the assistance work of the movement. We're always going to be performing more specific or builder movements, whatever the goal might be. If we're talking about a barbell sport athlete, it's just an easier concept to understand because, you know, squat, bench, deadlift, or snatch, clean and jerk. Or bodybuilding is weightlifting. Right? So the goal needs to stay the goal, but we might need to skew that pie chart to other areas until we can transition back into that main goal? Or are we in season where specificity would be high, absolute intensity would be also high, and then relative intensity will be skewed away from those assistance exercises until the end where, if you're training for a powerlifting meet, your last 2 to 4 weeks might just be only squat, bench, and deadlift, depending on the level of experience of the person, and so on. So I want to keep the barbell sport athlete in mind, but also address because you'll probably a lot of athletes as well. So they might not have specific lifts that they're trying to build, but you might be able to address all right, this person's strength coach, if you're not doing their program, this person's strength coach loves to trap bar deadlift the person. Well, if I know that the trap bar deadlift is that lift that's most meaningful to them, my goal with the rehab is to get them back to being full output capacity on that movement, despite the back pain that they're in right now. Okay, so we're going to progress from general to specific, and that's where we're going to reduce the amount of variation within the lift. So again, general to specific. So I might start with a goblet squat, progress to a Zercher squat, then to a front squat, then to a safety bar squat, then to a high bar squat, then to a low bar back squat. I went from general to specific because the low bar back squat is the competition movement. A goblet squat is our first iteration of a squat pattern that's probably the safest loadable pattern for that person. And if you notice, I can as you go down that level of progression, I won't be able to goblet squat as much as I can Zercher squat. I won't be able to Zercher squat as much as I can front squat. I won't be able to front squat as much as I can safety bar to high bar to low bar. Okay, that's essentially the center of mass, and the loading parameter influences the amount of absolute loading you place on the person. But I think it's worthwhile. Anyway, so usually your high bar squat is going to be between 90 and 95% of your low bar. Your front squat or your safety bar is going to be between 85 and 80%. Front squat usually 75 to 80%. Zercher squat is under 75. And then a goblet squat, you should be able to get pretty close. Usually dumbbells only go up to about 100 to 150 pounds, depending on what gym you're at. Some gyms have heavier dumbbells. I will essentially progress someone, especially when I'm dealing with a youth athlete, I'll progress them with a goblet squat as far as I can until they can do 20 reps with the heaviest dumbbell in that room, and then we'll front squat. Or as heavy as you can go without, and still hold it. When the holding it is the limiting factor, then we'll progress. So assistance lifts is essentially anything that isn't that main lift. So isn't that squat, isn't that bench, isn't that deadlift, isn't that snatch, clean and jerk. And they should always be specific to a deficit we're trying to address. So, and then including variation strategies to progress that lift. So an assistance lift in this regard, say on your squat, you miss your squat in the bottom. Well, your assistance lift could be a pause squat. So I'm manipulating an isometric hold in the bottom, which will increase time under tension, which will decrease absolute load, but I can still maximize relative intensity and address the weakness that I have in that main movement. Always looking at, again, keeping the goal. As absolute intensity declines, relative intensity can remain relatively high. And we're trying to allocate adaptive reserves when they're not available. So I can only do so much squatting, so much benching, so much deadlifting, to the point where I have to back off and do something different if I want to keep accumulating volume. Right? I can only do so many squats at 80% within a training session. But if I do a little bit less than that amount, say, let's just use arbitrary numbers. Say your maximum recoverable volume is 20 reps at 80%. But your maximum recoverable volume is 40 reps at 70%. If I want to keep getting stronger, why don't I take 10 of those reps at 80% and then do 1.5 times that many at 75% or 70% of a different variation that allows me to maintain that 8 out of 10 difficulty, but with less weight. Now we're starting to manipulate the system, still training hard. I just gave a couple of examples for assistance lift. that would progress instability, but regress absolute intensity. So taking the split squat as an example, a Hatfield split squat, so which is a hand supported. So if I was in the rack, split squat, I'd be holding the rack with the bar on my back. Then taking the hands off the rack and onto the safety bar. Then taking that safety bar away, going to dumbbells, and then going to a goblet, and manipulating the stability and the center of mass. As we go down that ladder, we're able to handle less load, but maintain the same level of relative intensity. So here the relationship is between specificity and intensity. So the more specific the exercise, the higher the absolute intensity will be. As we progress down the chain of manipulations, we're going to have to regress load. Okay, so a progression of instability or a progression of range of motion or a progression of time under tension results in a regression of absolute load. And we're always looking at the runway of progression. I don't want to start someone too low, that they're bored and they're not bought in, right? Because we're still training a person, they still need to enjoy the process. But then we're trying to have that runway to bring them back up to where they want to go. Having benchmarks or targets to know when we can move on, so those key performance indicators are movement quality, relative pain, output, those types of things. And we're always trying to keep the goal the goal. We're not trying to vary too much, just enough to keep them progressing. Now we're getting into progressions, regressions, and trade-offs. So, as you can probably see, I'm getting into the weeds quite a bit. But progression is required for training to occur. The imposed demands on the system must continue to increase the amplitude for adaptation to continue, which means we always need to be doing more to challenge our capacities, and we always need to continue to accumulate fatigue so that we can accrue fitness. Without fatigue, we have no fitness. We can only have so much fatigue before fitness declines. And progression is the imposed stimulus, and the adaptation of that stimulus will be specific in nature. Regression is a step back in the stimulus. Usually this is to accommodate recovery or to free up capacity, or to free up recovery capital for progressions in other areas. That's why I mentioned that pie chart, right? So if we regress the focus on strength, we can progress the focus in other areas. So it's always about trade-offs. You need to pull away as much as you need in order to take and put in somewhere else. That comes from data collection, that comes from feedback from the client. There's always things that we're like, a lot of what we do is a discussion of how do you feel? Are we able to progress this? Are you sore? Are the metrics that we're looking at going up or trending down? Okay, well, it's always trying to nudge them forward, but not so far forward. Okay? Keeping the goal and understanding the trade-offs of every decision made. Okay, this needs to be considered, especially when a trade-off places an increased demand on recovery. So, you might be in a position where you pulled away in an area and progressed another one, the person's doing fine. Okay, we're in that pie chart, maybe we're 60-40. Well, as soon as I push it to 70-30, the person starts breaking down. That's where that conversation starts to come in, right? Because once you've freed up that recovery capital, right? Once you've made deposits in your savings account, you got to withdraw it because we need to spend money to keep moving forward. But we want to make sure we don't overdraw. Okay? We have to weigh the benefit of the progression with the cost of the regression against the amount of fatigue you stand to accumulate. This is where it gets fun. So what trade-off am I willing to take to bring this athlete closer to their goals? So I talked about the regression of taking a barbell athlete and having them on the ground doing a bird dog. The trade-off there is they're moving so far away from a loaded pattern. But that might be required for where they're at. The key is we don't keep them there long enough that their fitness declines. And then will the regression accommodate for the increased fatigue accumulation of the progression? And it's always referring to load tolerance. When training with a concurrent model, like I talked about before, we can be really creative in our allocation for recovery capital. because we're addressing every individual aspect. So there's a lot of places to pull from. Maybe we pull back on the explosive work while we're focusing on tissue tolerance. But then as soon as we've addressed tissue tolerance for a given period of time, the person starts feeling better, let's get them back to explosive work as quickly as possible. We can build up everything slowly, for sure. But having areas where we bias training towards a specific need is also very valuable. And I don't know if you guys know this, but the amount of volume required to maintain an adaptation is like 30% of what it takes to build. So you can maintain your 1 RM strength doing 30% of the volume it took you to get to that 1 RM max. I think that's incredibly valuable, especially to educate your clients in that regard and say, hey, listen, we're going away from this, but we're still doing enough to maintain. The question is, how long can you maintain? So the quicker we can get back to that, the better. But if we can get buy-in by educating them and saying, hey, listen, I know that you want to be strong. It's okay that we're regressing because you're going to maintain with what we're doing, and then we can get back to progressing when you're pain-free. So within a long-term training plan, most, if not all of these manipulations are required, right? So there's going to be off-season, there's going to be in-season, there's going to be rehab, there's going to be reconditioning. People are going to go on vacation, they're going to have, things come up, they're going to go to a wedding, all this stuff. That all has to play into the total training model and training paradigm of that person. And that's accomplished through the strategic progression of some adaptations and the regressions of others through different periods of time. And we can look at it at the macro level of the training plan, like I mentioned, the pie chart. And we can also look at the micro level of each individual exercise and the modifications we're making to them. Some of the best results I've ever gotten with clients is by literally taking the same training program. Say it's 5 exercises. Squat, a split squat variation, a row variation, whatever it might be. As I progress the load on that squat, all I do in the other ones is I regress the load and progress the instability, or progress the time under tension, or make a variation that decreases the amount of load they can handle. Kept that volume the same, but the load kept going down, the squat kept going up. I just made this stuff equally challenging with less weight, because the weight influenced how much they could handle on that squat. So if these came down, this came up. Super simple. They did each variation for 4 weeks of their meet prep. Their meet prep was 12 weeks long. They did 3 different variations. Each variation got more challenging from an execution standpoint, less challenging from a load standpoint. We were able to progress their squat because that decrease in load in the assistance work freed up enough recovery capital to progress the squat. Super simple. Okay, so what can we progress and regress? We have our intensity. So the absolute load being lifted, or the difficulty of the activity, the volume, so how much we're doing in total, how many sessions we're doing, either within a week, within a month, or within a training block, time under tension, which we're looking at duration, the system is under strain, number of reps, tempo, the density, so how much work is being done within a specific period of time, the locus of stability, so whether it's internally stabilized by the body or externalized to a machine, the center of mass, the range of motion, and the speed. We can manipulate and progress and regress all of these. None of them exist in a vacuum. None of them. Because as you increase one, another one has to decrease. So what trade-offs are occurring? This is going to be a pretty valuable slide for you guys to review. I won't go through the whole thing, but you guys have it. Understanding why you would choose to progress or regress each different one of these adaptations, and the trade-offs inherent within them. So looking at intensity, like I can progress load to get stronger, but if I progress load, I have to decrease volume. Right? So I did that for all of these ones. So the big take home for you. So again, returning to the pie chart, I use the pizza here. So imagine recovery resources as a pizza. Each adaptation is a slice. The size of the slice is going to dictate the priority of each adaptation. We're going to allocate resources towards the desired training outcome. So in the off season, we're going to be wanting to focus on a balance of everything. Competition prep, we're going to bias towards strength with an emphasis on specificity and absolute loading. decrease emphasis on hypertrophy, decrease emphasis on neuromuscular function. Peaking, complete allocation towards strength. We're not gonna do any assistance work, just specificity. Same thing with, as you approach, say you're in a season of a competitive sport, at the end of that season, you're gonna play the sport and you're gonna do a little bit of prehab. That's your training, because you've transitioned all of your volume. Like, you think people competing in the Super Bowl are taking more maxes in the weight room? No, they're doing maintenance work in the weight room. And then for bodybuilding, strength will come as a byproduct of progressive overload. We're heavily biasing towards hypertrophy. And then the priorities of the training drive your decision making. So how much volume is allocated to each element, how many exposures you have, and will we bias absolute or relative intensity? And looking at the movement, what movements are we selecting, what modalities will we be using, what areas are we trying to address with these movements, and how can we modify these movements to achieve the goal? Questions? I went through that way faster.
Very interesting. There's a lot to take into account, but
Yeah, so if I can simplify it in like Cole's notes, we want to have the biggest toolbox we can, right? So the more that we understand the training paradigm as a whole and looking at the different variables that we're manipulating, whether it be, starting at the basic of intensity, volume, and frequency. Within those three, I know that as weights get heavier, I can't do as much or as often. As the weights get lighter, I can do more and I can do them more often. Doing them more often is obviously going to favor motor learning, right? More exposures, I'm going to be able to learn the movement and progress my skill better. So that has a place within your training plan. Then looking at your volume. Do you put it all within one session or do you put it multiple times per week? Depends. For example, for myself, I know that I don't have a lot of tolerance for frequency when it comes to lower body training because the stimulus of my lower body training is so high. Even if, an 80% squat for me is still 600 pounds. Even though a 600 pound squat is 80%, the absolute load is very high, so the systemic stress is much higher. The systemic stress of my 80% versus your 80% is going to be higher. It doesn't matter that I'm accommodated to it, it's still the case. Right? So the more you can do, the less you can tolerate. And that's why this is the art of the system. That's essentially what I wanted to showcase with this talk is we know the system, we know the variables, right? If we're looking at algebra, we know all the variables in the equation. The art of it is how do you manipulate the equation to get the outcome that you're after. And knowing that the way you manipulate it is going to be dependent on the person in front of you, their specific deficits, their specific goals. And that's why this is fun, because it's why there really is no right or wrong way to do things. Like I've been training for 17 years, and I can think of a million different ways that I've tried to accomplish the same goal. They've all worked to some extent. Like, I've PR'd my squat squatting 3 times a week. I've PR'd my squat squatting 1 repetition a week. Context. I know that was a lot. I wish I would have had it up on there, but.
no, that's great.
Do you have any other standards that you use with clients, like the goblet squat, like that they max out holding before you progress to the front squat, with any other lifts or exercises?
Yeah, I would do until you can do, I never use arbitrary numbers, just because the goblet squat is an easy example, because most gyms only have up to X amount.
Yeah.
But in terms of a push-up, if someone can't control their scapula on their rib cage, I'm not gonna pin their scapula to a bench, right? So that one would be more of a qualitative measurement. Looking at pull-ups, right? A pull-up is gonna be pretty indicative of torso stability. It's gonna be pretty indicative of, again, scapular movement on the rib cage, the ability to orient the rib cage on top of the pelvis, breathing mechanics, all those things are gonna play into it. So it really depends how far in the weeds that you wanna get. I very much like to look at this person's global ability to perform movement. And when you put in heuristics like, if you can't body weight squat, you shouldn't load a barbell. I can't body weight squat and I can squat 800 pounds. You know why I can't squat with my body weight? Because it's not heavy enough. Right? And that's where the outliers to these things make it more fun to some extent, because the rules don't necessarily apply the same for, you know, John Smith at Mobody or, you know, Ilya Ilin at the Olympics. You can't apply the same rules, but they're both working within the same constructs. Right? That's why it gets fun. And I'm sure, like, you guys deal with, you know, the elderly client with back pain who just wants to be able to carry their groceries into the house. You also deal with that youth athlete who wants to get back on the field. You're still dealing with sets, reps, locus of stability, tempo. You're still, the same toolbox is used for those two people, but the way you apply those tools is going to vary. And that's where you as a clinician need to have fun.
Awesome. Yeah, that was great. Learned a lot.
Cool.
Thanks for coming in.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah. I already need to go through that again and digest.
So what I'll do actually is I will upload the video to Google Drive and I'll send you that as well.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, because some of our questions were for today. So.
That'd be yes,
Yeah.
perfect. It's easy.